Well, good morning, church. Today we're concluding this series that I've titled A Surprise of Unfamiliar Friends. If you missed the earlier messages, I've invented this term for a collection of friends, a surprise, because a group of people who have become friends often is the result of surprises that no one expected would lead to their friendship. And our text for this series has been Acts chapter 16, where we find 6 very different characters who all encounter one another through their connection to Paul on what we often refer to as his second missionary journey. And those 6 characters, who are somewhat unfamiliar to us, but who offer to become our new friends, are the subjects of this sermon series. Now, we've already met 2 of Paul's companions on this journey. We've met Silas, also known as Silvanus, the respected prophet from Jerusalem. Paul chose him to accompany him when he set out from Antioch in Syria. And Silas's willingness to offer his skills and talents to serve with Paul in God's mission showed us the value of faithfulness and humility. We met Timothy, the young convert from a mixed-race family, whom Paul invited to come along as his assistant. Timothy's courage and willingness to serve Paul made him an excellent prospect for ministry leadership, someone whose family background and sincere faith and demonstrated character could help build bridges to the unbelieving Gentiles. We've also met Lydia, the Gentile God-fearer who was a merchant of expensive purple cloth and one of Paul's first converts in the city of Philippi. Her willingness to make everything she had available for the service of the Lord opened a way for the church in Philippi to gather, and her ability to persuade others led her household to faith as a part of the core of the new church. And we met the unnamed slave girl out of whom Paul had cast the demon. Though we cannot say whether or not she came to faith or became part of the church there, her deliverance demonstrated the salvation that Jesus could bring to anyone who was held captive by Satan. And last week we met the 5th character in the chapter, another unnamed individual, the rough Roman military veteran known only to us as the Philippian jailer. He and his family found salvation in Jesus Christ and became part of this newly planted congregation of believers, Jews and God-fearers, and now a household of formerly pagan Gentiles from different social classes and completely different backgrounds, all finding their place in the new community of followers of Jesus Christ. Now, some of you might be wondering where we're going to find our 6th character in this chapter of Acts. Well, Paul, of course, is prominent, but he doesn't fit the criteria of being unfamiliar. And as I noted already, these 6 characters are all joined to one another by virtue of their connection to Paul. So that sets him out of bounds for our purposes. The owners of the slave girl play a small part in the chapter, but they really don't rise to the level of being a character to which we ought to give our attention, certainly not someone we would befriend, even in the sense of appreciating them as a literary figure. And the same goes for the officers or the police, the lictors, or the magistrates, the praetors, and the unnamed other prisoners who were with Paul and Silas in the jail. They matter in the story, but their importance to us is minimal. Not so our 6th character. Our 6th character is also unnamed in the narrative, but he appears in the story in a very subtle and almost mysterious way. In fact, it's quite possible that you might not even have noticed when he showed up. That's why I gave you a bit of a hint this morning in the reading of our passages. I gave you 2 hints, actually. The first hint was that we changed the person who was reading at a particularly crucial spot in the narrative. Now, we actually did the same thing last week at the same spot. You probably don't remember it. And the second hint was the inclusion of a passage from elsewhere in the New Testament, the introduction to the 3rd gospel. Speaking of hints, how many of you here are old enough to remember the television game show, What's My Line, right? I was just a small kid when I saw it, so I'm not as old as some of you. But I did enjoy watching the celebrity panelists try to figure out what the guests did for a living. And if you remember, there was a portion of the show with a mystery celebrity guest who would sign in while the panelists were blindfolded. And they were sometimes given a hint to get them started, Then they had to ask questions to try to figure out who this was. That's sort of what we're going to do today. We're going to look at some clues to discover who our mystery sixth character in Acts 16 is. So let's go back to the text and look more closely at this place where we changed voices. Here's Acts 16, 6 through 9. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." The author is describing the travel of Paul and his companions, Silas and Timothy. They've traveled from central Anatolia to the coastal city of Troas. Notice the pronouns. They came to the border. They tried to enter. The Spirit of Jesus would not allow them. They passed by. Now look at verse 10. After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. And verses 11 to 12. From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace, and the next day we went on to Neapolis, and from there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony, and the leading city of that district of Macedonia, and we stayed there several days. Did you hear the change? No longer is the narrative in the third person told from the outside about what others are doing or experiencing, they and them. Now it is being told in the first person, from the inside, about what the group that includes the author is doing and experiencing. It's we and us. And this same thing continues all the way through verse 17. And then after verse 18, the story resumes using they and them. And the next chapter continues the story, retains the same third-person point of view as we heard when we changed voices again earlier, and Greg went back and began reading the first few verses of chapter 17. There is no explanation in the text that is given for the abrupt change in pronouns. It simply begins and then ends. But it's not the last time that we see this peculiar shift in the book of Acts. In addition to chapter 16, verse 10 to 17, there are 3 more times when the author suddenly switches to using we and us in place of they and them. The first one is in chapter 20, verses 5 to 15, when Paul returns to Philippi and then sails to Troas. The second one is from chapter 21, 1 to 18, when Paul sails from Miletus after he's met with the Ephesian elders and he resumes his journey to Jerusalem. And then thirdly, in chapter 27, verse 1 through 28:16, when Paul sails from Caesarea and continues on until he arrives in Rome. And these 4 passages are known as the we passages in Acts. They're very significant for a number of reasons, but primarily for this reason. They tell us that the author of the book was personally present for certain portions of the story. He was an eyewitness to some of the events he recorded for his readers. That's where my second hint for you comes in. If we compare the introduction to the third gospel with the introduction to the book of Acts, it is very clear that they were written by the same person. And those introductions also show us that the 2 books, the third gospel and the book of Acts, were intended to be read together as the first and second volumes of a single work. And let's note this as well. In the introduction to the gospel, the author includes himself in the group who have experienced what he calls the things that are fulfilled among us, or the things that have been fulfilled among us. He's in that group. He's been a participant in the mission of bringing the gospel to the Gentiles, even though he was not an apostle and not one of the original disciples. But he can attest to the reliability of the account he has written for his readers, who happen to mostly be Gentiles, who have responded to the gospel or are at least interested in knowing more about Jesus and this new faith. Both of these 2 volumes, the Gospel and the Book of Acts, are strictly speaking anonymous. Neither book indicates the identity of the author within the text. So who was he, and how do we know that? Well, the we passages tell us that the author was a companion of Paul for at least 3 significant periods of time, including his 2 years of house arrest in Rome. So any of Paul's companions who are also named in the we passages may therefore be eliminated as candidates for authorship because the author distinguishes himself from them. Now, during his 2 years in Rome, Paul wrote the letters to the Ephesians, to the Colossians, to Philemon, and possibly to the Philippians. So since the author was with Paul at that time, it is reasonable to assume that Paul might mention him in one or more of these letters. So when we compare the letters that Paul wrote, those 4 letters, to the book of Acts, we are left with a very small group of possible candidates who are mentioned in those 4 letters of Paul, but who are not mentioned in the we passages. And someone in that short list is the most likely candidate for the authorship of Acts. But how do we narrow the list? It's at this point that we have to look for evidence elsewhere besides the text of the Gospel or the text of Acts itself. And the place we look to is the tradition of the early church. And here we find something that is fairly remarkable and quite substantial. You see, the consistent and uniform tradition of the early church is that the author of the 3rd Gospel and of the book of Acts is the man whom Paul calls the beloved physician, Luke. The fact that no other name is suggested is significant. Why? Because Luke is not an apostle, he's not one of the original disciples, he's not even Jewish. And given the concern of the early church to preserve the authority of apostolic teaching, we would certainly expect some challenges raised about his gospel in the early church if there were any concerns about its authorship. But there are none. Even a man named Marcion, who was a heretical teacher, very prominent in Rome in the middle of the 2nd century, Marcion attributes the 3rd Gospel to Luke. Now, the church repudiated Marcion and all of his teaching, but they did not reject his identification of Luke as the author, despite wanting to disassociate themselves from him as far as possible. Now, you see, the traditions are quite uniform. All of the earliest attestations of authorship, beginning from the middle of the 2nd century onward, identify Luke as the author. And since it is very doubtful that the original manuscripts lack the author's name, since they were dedicated to his patron, it's safe to conclude that the tradition had a basis in fact. No one in the early church disputed that Luke was the author. And it's very difficult to understand why Luke's name would be attached to the Gospel or to the book of Acts if he was not the author, given the early church's insistent appeal to apostolic connection in order to certify the genuineness of the New Testament documents. In the words of 2 premier New Testament scholars who also happen to be my professors, Doug Moo and D.A. Carson, the universal, I quote, "the universal identification of a non-apostle as the author of almost 1/4 of the New Testament speaks strongly for the authenticity of the tradition." Well, who then is this Luke? We know that he was a Gentile. How do we know that? Colossians 4, verses 7 to 14, letter of Paul, includes a list of Paul's companions who are with him and who will be coming to the Colossians or who are sending them greetings. In verses 10 through 11, Paul mentions 3 men whom he says these are the only fellow workers with him who are Jewish, that is, from the circumcision. Luke is listed later in verse 14, indicating that he is not one of the 3 Jewish brethren there with Paul. That same verse in Colossians also refers to him as the beloved physician, indicating that he's somewhat known. Apparently, then, he was a doctor, a healer of some kind. Physicians in the Greco-Roman world were fairly well respected for their knowledge and their skills, though they were not necessarily wealthy or high in social status as we would think today. Some physicians, for instance, were slaves. It is interesting to note that Luke's vocabulary includes quite a bit of medical terminology. That isn't enough to prove that he is a physician, but it is consistent with the hypothesis that the author was a physician. We know that Luke must have been well educated. We can see that from the fact that he has written a significant literary work of 2 volumes, and included in these 2 volumes are sections where he employs a style that resembles that of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, and other sections, such as the 2 introductions, that are more like classical Greek literary style. His accounts are similar to other historical writings of the first century, and they include polished rhetorical elements, such as the speeches which make up much of the narrative in Acts. And furthermore, he insists that he has done rigorous research to establish what was factual and to distinguish that from what was legendary or rumored. Now, Luke's familiarity with the Septuagint tells us that he was very likely a God-fearer, someone who had left paganism to worship the God of Israel, to learn from the Hebrew Scriptures, although in the Greek translation, and to affiliate with the Jewish community. That would certainly account for his demonstrated interest in pointing out the God-fearers who responded to Paul's preaching of the gospel in the synagogues, such as we heard in the passage from Acts 17 this morning. What we don't know is how Luke came to faith, or when, or how he came to know Paul. The early church tradition that identifies him as Luke also identifies him as a Syrian from Antioch, though we don't have a basis for that identification, or it's at least uncertain. If it's true, then it's certainly possible that it was in Antioch that he learned about Jesus, probably from Paul and Barnabas. And if not, if that tradition is incorrect, then we really have no clues about how and when he heard the gospel for the first time and how it was that he came to believe it. What we do know is that he joined Paul and his other companions in Troas prior to Paul's dream that took them to Macedonia. Either he met Paul for the first time here, or he just simply happened to be there when Paul arrived in Troas. And when we compare where the author inserts himself into the narrative in chapters 16 and 20, it also appears that when Paul and Silas had to leave Philippi, Luke was left behind to care for the church, either with Timothy, at least for a short time before Timothy had to rejoin the team in Thessalonica, or what is more likely, Luke just left there on his own. And Luke stayed there for quite some time, because when Paul returns to Macedonia, it's more than 2 years later in Acts chapter 20, verses 1 to 4. And he stops in Philippi before setting sail for Troas in verse 5 of chapter 20. And it is precisely at that point in the narrative that the author begins the second we passage to indicate that he has rejoined Paul. So Paul leaves Philippi, Luke stays behind, Paul comes back to Philippi 2 years later, Luke rejoins him. That tells us something else about Luke. By the time he met Paul in Troas before coming to Greece, he was already sufficiently mature in the faith to take responsibility for overseeing the church in Philippi. At the very least, he was already quite familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures and could readily understand Paul's presentation of the gospel. Because Paul felt confident that he could leave the brand new congregation in Luke's hands, sure that he would be able to accurately pass on to them the right understanding of the gospel and the teachings of Jesus. He trusted that Luke would be able to guide them to spiritual health and maturity with whatever help Paul could provide by letters. Now later, Luke would spend several years attending to Paul and assisting him while he was under arrest and awaiting trial. In those years, he became, in Paul's words, beloved, a dear friend. Luke's account in Acts ends with Paul in Rome in chains, under house arrest, awaiting trial before Caesar, as was his right as a Roman citizen. Now, the charges that Paul faced were unwarranted and unsubstantiated. The Jews who had accused him had hoped to simply murder him while he was in Jerusalem. But when Paul appealed to Caesar, he set in motion an inexorable legal process with very strict requirements that would take years to finish. Not only that, he also set in motion a legal process that would be very costly to prosecute, since the Jews who accused him would have to come to Rome to present their case before Caesar himself, something that they were not going to do. So at that point, there was no way that they could achieve their end, and without an active prosecution, the case would have been dropped and Paul released. But prior to his release, Paul's situation was very serious. He was facing charges that could have resulted in his death. And for 4 years, while he's waiting for his case to be decided, he was a prisoner in chains. To be in chains was not only uncomfortable and inconvenient, it marked him as a criminal. Someone to be avoided, someone to be disavowed, someone from whom you dissociated. But Luke stayed with him during all of those years. He remained a faithful friend, caring for Paul's needs, assisting him with ministry to the churches, and doing his own research in order to write a clear and orderly, truthful and persuasive account of the life and teachings of Jesus the Messiah and of the ongoing mission of the resurrected Son of God who sent his Holy Spirit to empower the church to take the gospel to the entire world. Luke did not succumb to the pressure to repudiate his friend Paul. He wasn't ashamed to be seen with him, to associate with him. He was willing to bear the public dishonor, just as he was willing to bear the public dishonor of being a follower of Christ, the rejected Messiah, whose crucifixion was seen as shameful according to the culture, but whom God vindicated by raising him from the dead and seating him at his right hand as the Lord of all. Luke embraced both of those things. He embraced the cross of Christ and all that Paul had taught him to understand about it. And he embraced the messenger, his teacher, Paul himself, whose life of discipleship had brought him dishonor in the eyes of the world, but true honor in the sight of God. In fact, though I don't have time this morning to demonstrate this for you, one of the principal purposes Luke had in writing his second volume, the book of Acts, was to defend Paul's honor, his reputation, his gospel, the churches he started, and the faith he proclaimed against the libelous accusations against him that had led to his imprisonment and the defamation of the church as a result. Luke's devotion to Paul continued long after he was finally released from prison, and it culminated in the composition of what we now know as the book of Acts, offered to Theophilus, his patron, in defense of the Christian faith and the Apostle Paul. So we don't know when Luke met Paul for the very first time. But when he joined Paul and Silas in Troas on that second missionary journey of Paul, there's nothing in the text in Acts 16 to suggest that he was expected. In fact, it suggests exactly the opposite, that Luke's addition to Paul's company was an unexpected surprise, a moment of divine serendipity, if you will. But he was a gift. Luke was a great gift. His assistance to the Philippian church was invaluable. That little group of dissimilar folk who were unlikely to have anything in common with one another and little reason to stay together found a common life in Jesus and an unexpected leader who could help them to stay true to what Paul had taught them. Luke was God's gift to them, and God's gift to Paul, who had to leave this church in its infancy in the hands of someone else. And Luke would be Paul's faithful friend clear to the end of his life. In the last letter we have from Paul, when he writes to tell Timothy that he's coming to the end, having finished his race, he mentions, "Only Luke is with me." That's 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. And as the centuries since then have demonstrated, Luke was also an unexpected gift to the entire church. His 2 volumes, constituting about 1/4 of the total of the New Testament, contain some of the most profound and richest teaching in all of the Bible. Without them, we would have no context for understanding Paul's letters. Nothing that would help us understand who he was, what he was writing, and why it was so important. Without those 2 volumes, our knowledge of the earliest church would be minuscule at best. And I would go so far to even argue that without Luke's gospel and the book of Acts, we cannot fully understand what it meant to be a follower of Jesus Christ in the first century or what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ in this century. God is a giver of good gifts. And some of his very best gifts come in the form of people. Surprising gifts who start out as unfamiliar strangers and become familiar friends. And from those friends, we then receive more gifts in the form of help that they provide, help from God, help that allows us to understand God more accurately, to handle life better, to live as faithful disciples of the Lord Jesus. God gives us those gifts because he loves to bless us. And it is absolutely right and good to enjoy the gifts that he gives us, including the unexpected surprise of an unfamiliar stranger who becomes a friend. They are intended to bring us good. But like every gift from God, ultimately, they're intended to bring our focus away from the gift and back to the giver, so that we live continually grateful to God for all that he has given us. For in the end, our greatest gift from God is the unexpected surprise of his own friendship, offered to us through Jesus, the unique, only begotten Son of God. God himself come to us in the person of his Son to reconcile us to the Father through the death of his Son on the cross.